Most people have a completely inaccurate idea of what an empath truly is. They assume empathy means being endlessly emotional, endlessly patient, and endlessly willing to forgive. In their minds, an empath is someone who endlessly absorbs the pain of others, overlooks every mistake, and constantly sacrifices themselves simply because they care too deeply. But genuine empathy is something entirely different. From a psychological perspective, empathy extends far beyond emotion. It is a form of perception. It is the ability to recognize subtle emotional cues, notice when someone's words don't match their actions, and sense underlying tension long before anyone else realizes it exists. An empath doesn't only listen to what people choose to say. They pay close attention to what remains unsaid. They notice body language, changes in tone, brief moments of hesitation, forced smiles, and the emotions concealed beneath polished conversations. What many people dismiss as oversensitivity is actually an advanced ability to recognize patterns. An empath is not weak because they experience emotions deeply. They are strong because they detect what most people overlook. That awareness is both a blessing and a burden. When you can see beyond someone's behavior, you're naturally more likely to understand the reasons behind it. Rather than instantly labeling someone as selfish or cruel, an empath wonders what experiences shape them into who they are. Instead of responding with anger, they search for context. They think about childhood wounds, disappointments, hidden fears, insecurities, or silent struggles that may have influenced the person's actions. Their instinct is to understand before they judge. This is exactly why empaths often remain in relationships much longer than logic would suggest. They don't only love the person standing in front of them, they also become attached to the person they believe that individual could become if they finally healed. They invest themselves in possibility. They see the frightened child hiding behind the guarded adult. They recognize pain beneath arrogance, fear beneath anger, and loneliness beneath emotional distance. That perspective is undeniably beautiful, but it also hides a dangerous trap. When you constantly explain other people's behavior, you gradually begin explaining away your own suffering. You reassure yourself that they didn't really mean it. You convince yourself they're simply overwhelmed. You believe they'll change once life becomes less difficult. You tell yourself one honest conversation can repair years of unhealthy patterns. An empath doesn't overlook red flags because they fail to notice them. They overlook them because they believe that truly understanding someone is enough to help transform them. But understanding can never replace accountability. One of the most difficult psychological truths a person can accept is that you may completely understand why someone hurts you while still realizing they are not safe to keep close. Compassion and healthy boundaries are not opposites. In reality, mature empathy depends on both. Without boundaries, compassion slowly becomes self-abandonment. Without discernment, kindness becomes permission. Without self-respect, forgiveness becomes an open invitation for repeated harm. Many empaths don't discover this truth until years of emotional exhaustion have already taken their toll. They spend so much of their energy trying to become someone else's safe place that they forget to create safety for themselves. They become incredibly skilled at comforting everyone around them while silently carrying wounds that no one ever thinks to ask about. And because they rarely demand attention for their own pain, people gradually begin believing they don't have any. This creates a dangerous pattern. The more dependable an empath becomes, the more others expect their patience to have no limits. The more forgiving they appear, the more people assume they'll always receive another chance. The more understanding they are, the less effort some individuals make to change. Eventually, kindness is no longer appreciated, it simply becomes expected. Yet appreciation is one of the foundations that keeps healthy relationships alive. There is an important philosophical principle hidden inside this reality. Every relationship operates through invisible exchanges. Trust is exchanged for honesty. Respect is exchanged for vulnerability. Care is exchanged for care. When one person keeps giving, while the other only continues taking, the relationship slowly shifts away from connection and toward imbalance. Because the empath is so focused on preserving peace, they often fail to notice this shift immediately. But peace that depends entirely on one person's sacrifice isn't genuine harmony at all. It's simply imbalance wearing the disguise of harmony. This is where one of the biggest misconceptions about empaths finally falls apart. Many people believe empaths forgive because they don't have the strength to leave. The truth is almost the exact opposite. Empaths forgive because they sincerely hope people will grow into the best version of themselves. They stay because they believe healing is possible. They continue believing because they understand that no person is defined solely by their worst moments. But every act of patience eventually reaches its limit. Every heart has a threshold. And every deeply compassionate person arrives at a moment when understanding another person's pain is no longer enough to justify ignoring their own. When that realization finally appears, everything that follows begins to change. Remember this: empathy is not measured by how much suffering you're willing to endure for someone else. It is measured by how wisely you protect your own humanity while continuing to choose compassion. The energy that was once devoted to fixing, rescuing, and endlessly waiting gradually returns to where it always belonged. The empath begins to realize how peaceful life can feel when they stop carrying burdens that were never theirs to bear. Little by little, they reconnect with the parts of themselves that had been buried beneath years of constant emotional responsibility. What once seemed like an unbearable loss slowly transforms into a sense of freedom. That is the real point of no return. It isn't the moment an empath stops loving. It's the moment they stop sacrificing themselves in the hope that someone else will finally decide to change. Because once clarity becomes stronger than false hope, your future finally becomes your own again. After an empath reaches that level of complete clarity, many people assume the most difficult part has already passed. They believe that with enough time, everything will simply return to the way it used to be. An apology should be enough. One heartfelt conversation should erase the emotional distance. A few weeks of improved behavior should rebuild what took years to create. But this is where one of the greatest misunderstandings about empathy begins to reveal itself. Empaths are usually willing to forgive mistakes. They can forgive misunderstandings. They can even forgive emotional reactions that happen during moments of stress. What they struggle to forgive is something entirely different: the repeated violation of trust after they have already allowed themselves to become emotionally vulnerable. There is a profound psychological distinction between hurting someone because you genuinely didn't or know better, and hurting them after they have clearly explained exactly what causes them pain. The first may come from ignorance. The second becomes a conscious choice. And choice changes everything. Think about what vulnerability truly is. When an empath opens their heart, they are doing far more than sharing personal information. They are handing someone the map to their inner world. They reveal their fears, their dreams, their insecurities, and the experiences that shaped who they became. They trust another person with knowledge that can either deepen intimacy or be turned into a weapon. Emotionally healthy people protect that trust. Emotionally unhealthy people learn how to use it for their own advantage. That is why betrayal feels so different from ordinary disappointment. Disappointment says, "You let me down." Betrayal says, "You used what I trusted you with against me." For an empath, that wound reaches much deeper than emotion alone. It challenges their entire belief that openness leads to genuine connection. Suddenly, the very quality that once made relationships meaningful begins to feel unsafe. Not because empathy has become a weakness, but because trust has repeatedly been treated as though it has no value. This is also where many people confuse forgiveness with reconciliation. They are not the same thing. Forgiveness is an internal decision to stop allowing resentment to control your life. Reconciliation is an external decision to continue allowing someone access to your life. One can exist without the other. You can sincerely wish someone peace while also recognizing they are no longer emotionally safe enough to remain close to you. Reaching that understanding is one of the most emotionally mature decisions a person can make. Unfortunately, those who benefited from the empath's endless patience often find it difficult to accept. They interpret healthy boundaries as punishment. They describe distance as selfishness. They accuse the empath of becoming a different person. But the truth is much simpler. The empath hasn't become colder. They've become more accurate. From a psychological standpoint, trust is built through consistency. Every positive interaction strengthens the brain's expectation of safety. Every repeated violation slowly weakens it. Eventually, a point is reached where the nervous system no longer experiences someone's presence as comforting. Instead, it automatically begins preparing for disappointment before anything has even happened. This isn't holding on to resentment. It's learning. The nervous system is designed to remember whatever repeatedly threatens emotional security. That memory exists for protection, not for revenge. There is also an important philosophical lesson hidden within this reality. Character is never defined by isolated moments. It reveals itself through repeated choices. Anyone can behave well when life is easy. Anyone can make promises when nothing is at stake. but patterns reveal identity far more reliably than intentions ever can. Eventually, the empath stops listening to promises and starts paying attention to behavior. Patterns rarely announce themselves loudly. They simply repeat. And repetition has a remarkable way of revealing the truth. That is why some betrayals permanently change a relationship, even when forgiveness eventually exists. Once someone has repeatedly shown that your honesty will be dismissed, your kindness will be taken advantage of, or your boundaries will continually be ignored, your entire perception of them changes at its foundation. Respect cannot survive where emotional safety continues to disappear. The empath eventually understands something that many people spend their entire lives avoiding. Love only remains meaningful when it exists alongside trust. Without trust, love slowly transforms into anxiety. Every conversation begins to feel uncertain. Every promise becomes difficult to believe. Every period of silence starts carrying emotional tension. That isn't connection. That's survival. And healthy relationships were never meant to feel like survival. So the empath begins making different choices. They stop evaluating people by who they might become, and instead begin judging them by the consistency of who they repeatedly prove themselves to be. They stop asking themselves, what do they claim to feel? And start asking a far more important question. What does their behavior continue to prove? That single shift changes everything, because behavior can only hide the truth for so long. People can give convincing explanations. They can offer emotional apologies. They can promise life-changing transformation. But true character isn't revealed during emotional speeches. It is revealed in the ordinary choices a person makes day after day, especially when no one is forcing them to choose differently. Eventually, the empath understands that protecting their own peace is not an act of rejection. It is an act of respect. Respect for their emotional well-being, their personal values, and the life they are trying to create. The point of no return is never born from hatred. It grows out of wisdom. It is the quiet realization that certain doors must remain closed, not because forgiveness is impossible, but because self-respect is no longer something they are willing to negotiate. And sometimes, the greatest form of forgiveness is choosing never to return to the place where you first learned to betray yourself. What happens after an empath reaches that point of no return is something very few people expect. Many imagine their life becomes consumed by bitterness, anger, or thoughts of revenge. They assume the empath spends endless hours replaying old conversations, wishing the other person would finally understand the pain they caused. But the reality is far quieter and far more powerful. The empath simply stops investing emotional energy where there is no emotional return. That statement may sound simple, yet psychologically it represents one of the greatest transformations a person can experience. For years, their attention had been directed outward. They constantly monitored other people's emotions, anticipated their needs, prevented unnecessary conflict, offered reassurance, and carried responsibilities that were never truly theirs. Their emotional world revolved around preserving connection, even when it required sacrificing themselves. Then, almost without realizing it, everything begins to shift. Instead of asking, how can I save this relationship, they begin asking, how can I protect my own well-being? That is not selfishness. That is healing. Human attention is one of the most valuable resources we possess. Wherever our attention goes, our emotional energy naturally follows. If your mind is constantly occupied by someone else's instability, very little energy remains to build your own life. The empath eventually realizes that every hour spent trying to rescue someone who has no desire to grow is another hour taken away from becoming the person they were always meant to be. So they begin taking that time back. They return to passions they had forgotten. They reconnect with people who genuinely support them. They pursue meaningful work. They spend quiet time alone without feeling guilty for it. And something extraordinary begins to happen. The silence that once felt painfully lonely slowly starts feeling peaceful. This transformation often confuses the people left behind. Those who had grown accustomed to the empath's endless patience suddenly discover that the emotional support they always relied upon is no longer available. Phone calls remain unanswered. Arguments no longer receive a response. Manipulation no longer creates guilt. The familiar emotional cycle simply comes to an end. For someone who depended on control, this feels shocking. For the empath, it feels like breathing again. There is an interesting psychological principle behind this. Human beings quickly adapt to whatever is consistently available. Appreciation often fades when kindness becomes predictable. Many people fail to recognize the value of someone's emotional presence until that presence quietly disappears, not because the empath wanted to punish them with absence, but because their emotional energy finally found a healthier destination. Ironically, this is often the stage where other people finally begin to change. Not always because they have suddenly developed emotional awareness, but because consequences succeed where conversations repeatedly failed. When comfort disappears, reality becomes impossible to ignore. Yet by this point, something inside the empath has fundamentally changed. Their goal is no longer to be understood. Their goal is to remain faithful to their own peace. That distinction changes everything. When your identity depends upon another person's approval, your emotional stability remains tied to their reactions. But when your identity becomes rooted in your own values, your choices no longer require someone else's permission. This is the quiet strength that appears after deep emotional growth. The empath becomes more selective, not because they care less, but because they finally understand the cost of giving their heart to people who repeatedly misuse it. They still love deeply. They still listen with compassion. They still offer kindness. But now that kindness is guided by discernment instead of blind hope, they discover that every relationship deserves basic compassion, but not every relationship deserves unlimited access to their heart. This wisdom extends far beyond romantic relationships. It shapes friendships, family dynamics, workplaces, and every environment where emotional energy is exchanged. The empath begins asking one simple question that quietly transforms everything. Does this relationship encourage mutual growth, or does it constantly require me to abandon myself? That question becomes their compass, and with that compass comes freedom. From a philosophical perspective, every meaningful transformation requires leaving behind an old identity. The empath who once believed love meant endless endurance gradually becomes someone who, one, understands that genuine love must also include self-respect. They stop measuring their value by how much pain they can survive, and begin measuring it by how faithfully they live according to their own principles. That is profound growth. The world often admires people who never give up on others. Perhaps it should also celebrate those who finally stop giving up on themselves. There is tremendous strength in choosing peace instead of chaos, truth instead of illusion, and healthy boundaries instead of constant approval. None of those choices require cruelty. They only require clarity. The point of no return is not the conclusion of the empath's journey. It is simply the ending of one chapter and the beginning of another, a chapter defined not by survival, but by intention. The wounds that once influenced every decision slowly become lessons instead of chains. The silence that once felt empty becomes the place where confidence quietly grows. The heart that spent years carrying everyone else's own burdens finally discovers what it feels like to carry its own dreams. And perhaps that is the greatest irony of all. The very moment some people believe they have lost the empath is often the exact moment the empath finally finds themselves. So if there is only one truth worth remembering, let it be this: never confuse endless patience with endless permission. A compassionate heart can endure far more than most people ever realize. But once it learns that self-respect is the highest expression of love, it never chooses to walk backward into the life it was courageous enough to leave behind.